Just looking at the factors that have contributed to the slowdown. So, Namibia was actually very fiscally prudent from independence until sort of 2010. And then in order to try and sort of stave off these icy headwinds from the rest of the world, we had pretty aggressive fiscal expansion. And we ran huge budget deficits from 2011 basically right up until now, and forecast to continue for another few years at the very least. And then at the same time, we had the central bank cut interest rates aggressively. So there's something called the impossible trinity in economics, which basically says that you can't have a fixed exchange rate regime, independent monetary policy, and free flow of capital between or outside of your borders. And basically, that meant that we theoretically couldn't deviate too far from South Africa's monetary policy position from 2010 up until 2015. So we had very, very low interest rates at a time when there was a huge amount of surplus debt capacity in households, and banks were very, very keen to lend. And so we saw a huge uptake in household debt. So we've got a household debt to disposable income ratio now of just under 100%. In South Africa, it's about 70%, so materially more leveraged households than in South Africa. And then at the same time, we went from government debt levels of 16% of GDP, 16% of GDP, to now around 50% of GDP in a 6-year period or 5-year period. And so it's, and then, and then at the same time, we had quite a lot of investment into our mining sector. So FDI into our mining sector, new mines being built that doubled our copper capacity or copper production capacity, doubled our uranium capacity, and doubled our gold capacity. But then in 2015, basically, new president. At the same time, government started to realize that the fiscal expansion was not sustainable anymore, and we started to run these budget deficits of 9% or so of GDP. And then obviously South Africa started hiking interest rates, Namibia hiking interest rates as well. And then just the sort of cherry on the cake, 2 pieces of policy. One was called the new Equitable Empowerment Framework. You can guess what's in that. And the other was a piece of legislation called the Investment Promotion Act. So maybe just starting with the latter, the Investment Promotion Act is basically a piece of legislation that, despite its name, was, very, very anti-investment. It reserved certain sectors of the economy for Namibians only. It put huge amounts of power into the hands of ministers. If you wanted to expand your business or invest in the country, the minister could decide not only whether you could do it, but who your partner would be. So a Namibian business wanting to expand, basically the minister could tell you that this chap would be your partner. And then it had brilliant clauses in it, like if you're a foreign investor in the country, there's no guarantee of your ability to repatriate either your invested capital or your profits. And there was a whole sort of chain of command that you had to go through if you ever wanted to get money back out of the country. And so you can imagine what that did to foreign investment. Then the other piece of legislation is this new Equitable Empowerment Framework. And the idea behind that, I mean, the stated objectives for all of this legislation is fine, right? It's that, we have historical issues, and those historical issues are pervasive, and we need to sort of try and ensure that there's greater equality and particularly from an opportunity type perspective. But I always tell people, if it was as simple as saying, this is an empowerment bill and it'll cause empowerment, then we'd have sort of zero poverty and, great wealth bills as well. But it's not that simple. And so, that piece of legislation just, in bill form, pitched up at just, the wrong time. I don't think that there's ever really a right time for such a thing, but it pitched up at the wrong time, and it required that all businesses in Namibia, so literally from a sole proprietor right through to your biggest listed company, would be required to have 25% previously disadvantaged ownership and 50% previously disadvantaged management control. So basically, no white male sole proprietors, because there's obviously no way you can achieve those objectives, and then would just basically create this environment that was absolutely ripe for looting and major enrichment by a handful of individuals, and do probably very little for your average kind of person that it was theoretically designed to create opportunities for. And the investor response was exactly what you'd expect. We saw 2016, so that was in 2015, 2016, 17, and 18. We've seen the lowest levels of gross fixed capital formation that we've had since independence, the lowest level now in 2018 since 1987, pre-independence. and we've got some of the lowest levels of net foreign direct investment coming in as well. I think the third lowest level of net foreign direct investment since independence as well. So investors are doing exactly what you'd expect investors to do. But what's interesting now, we always talk about the kind of the policy levers that government has available to it, or that the country has available to it to rekindle growth. And what's interesting in our situation is there's no scope for growth from households because they're highly leveraged. We see unemployment is picking up. We don't really see that there's any kind of room for growth in households. Government spending, there's no real room for growth. We're running huge budget deficits at the moment. There's some room for improvement with regards to capital allocation. But what we've seen the last few years is that we've kind of gone through an austerity cycle. The Minister of Finance has tried to push this austerity cycle, which was, we had to kind of put the brakes in government spending, but it's been done in such an ineffective manner that we basically stripped out all the high multiplier government spending, and we just stuck with the rubbish. We're stuck with all of the bad spending that has no long-term benefit, has just a huge drag on our imports. Wages and salaries, bailing out state-owned enterprises. We've got the fifth highest civil service wage bill relative to GDP in the world. Bailing out state-owned enterprises, more and more going to debt servicing now. And so on. So there's not much space for to stimulate the economy from that. And so you're basically finding yourself in a situation where the only real sort of scope for stimulus is, we don't have much scope on interest rates either. So the only real scope for stimulus is investment. And yet we just score one investment own goal after the next. So I think that's basically the kind of core driving factor behind the economic sort of collapse that we've seen.